This is the first lecture for Chapter 19 for Biology 1441, Bio 2 with Professor Carafit. We are going to talk about evolution, so descent with modification. And that's where we'll be for a little while in this course. It's the most important topic in biology, so I think it's an important one to spend some time on. Okay, in Bio 1, we talked about chemistry. Chemistry, we talked about cells, we talked about DNA and reproduction, and we talked about protein production. Remember, DNA codes for RNA, which codes for protein and all that, right? That's where we left off in Bio 1. We kind of pick up there in Bio 2. So we're going to zoom out a bit and look at life rather than proteins and individual cells for the most part, but we are going to go back to those ideas. So the Earth has millions of species. We'll talk about what that means later in the course. Each species has traits that allow them to survive in their particular environment. We call those adaptations. Adaptations are those unique traits that different species have. Like this beetle right here has the ability to collect water droplets on its legs to survive in the desert. Not all beetles can do that. However, all organisms have some traits that they share in common. So what are some examples? You might pause the video and see what you can come up with on your own. This would be a good test question. What are some, test questions, for example, on this slide? Define adaptation and list some things that all organisms share in common. What are some things all organisms share in common? They all have cells, one or more cells, right? They all metabolize energy. I'm just going to write energy here. That's pretty crude. You should say metabolize energy, right? Metabolize energy. They photosynthesize, they respire. What else do they do? They reproduce. So on and so forth. You can come up with your own list there. So life is diverse, but life is also unified. That's the important thing to take from this slide. Life is diverse, meaning lots of diversity, but they also share some things in common. Diverse and unified. So when we look at this idea of evolution, we can look at it from two perspectives. First of all, there's the fact of evolution. The fact or the pattern, same thing. Organisms change and adapt over time. We can see the results of that in the adaptations of living species. We can see that it has happened. We can go back to the fossil record and see that things have changed. There's a pattern to it. That's the fact of evolution, the pattern. But we can also then try to figure out how that pattern happened. That's the process of evolution. And this is where more of what you might think of as the theory of evolution comes in. This is the mechanism, the process. How did organisms change and adapt over time? So we can look at the fact, the pattern, and we can also then make hypotheses about how the process works. And we can test those hypotheses, which of course are heavily supported because we do call this the theory of evolution. And remember, in science, a theory is as close to proven as we get. We don't say proven in science, but we say it's supported by the data. We have not been able to falsify the theory of evolution. But we didn't always know about evolution. If we go back in time to the 1800s, well, before the 1800s, 1700s here or so. We're going back even further in time for this slide. 322 BCE. We'll move up to 1700s in the next slide. 322 BCE, that's before the Common Era. There's this guy named Aristotle, a Greek philosopher, and he thought that life was perfect and permanent and unchanging, and life forms were made in kind of a hierarchy. They call this the scala natura, or the scale of nature. There's bacteria down here. Of course, Aristotle didn't know about that, but he knew about plants. And then animals were better than plants, and certain animals were better than other animals. And then above the animals were the celestial beings, right? And so there was this scale of life. That was the view of how things work, the scale of life. Things were created, but some things were created with more abilities than others. That view fit well with, in the West, with the biblical narrative of life too. And so Carl Linnaeus comes along in the 1700s. You've heard of him, I'm sure. He created the binomial nomenclature, the binomial format for naming organisms. So humans are Homo sapiens, for example. And he came up with the nested classification system: kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, and species. He thought that the scale of nature was real, that life was permanent and unchanging, but he thought that organisms were created in different categories. Like, how weird, mammals all have hair. Oh, cool, reptiles all have this, fish all have this. So he categorized organisms based on their features, but he thought they were all made that way, okay? That they were all just made perfect and permanent, and that there was the scale of nature. Some people at the time, or slightly later, also thought that some organisms were trying to change and kind of climb that scale of nature. That was a view that some people had back in the day as well. But what happens is science kicks in. We don't just make up ideas and hope they fit with what a Bible says or something like that, but we test ideas, and when the ideas are falsified, we have to change our minds. And so what happens at the time is folks start studying geology, and they notice that rocks often occur in layers. Sedimentary rocks occur in layers. And they come up with this idea that the ones on the bottom are older and the ones on the top are newer or younger, right? And this is called the Law of Superposition. The idea that rock layers on the bottom are older than the rock layers on the top. So the Law of Superposition. And they also notice that there's fossils in these rocks sometimes. And the fossils change in the rock layers, which is weird, because if life is perfect and unchanging, if they were created perfect by some creator and that they would be there forever, nothing would go extinct, nothing changes, then we wouldn't expect to see organisms changing in the rock layers. So that opened up some questions. And there was two different ways to explain this based on what kind of camp you were in. Those who followed the scale of nature camp said, such as Georges Cuvier, that rock layers represented big catastrophes like earthquakes and floods. So there were organisms living there. They didn't change or go extinct, but they got wiped out by a flood and some new ones moved in. And that's why you see changes in the critters in the rock layer. He also thought that mountains formed quickly by earthquakes, big earthquakes pushing up mountains, and valleys formed quickly by floods. That was called catastrophism. Catastrophes caused the changes we see in the rock record. But Lyell and Hutton, at different times, but their ideas were kind of combined, formed this new notion known as Uniformitarianism. Notice the important word there is uniform. So what they noticed was, when there are earthquakes today, new mountains don't just show up. They might grow by a ½ inch, but they don't just show up. And when there's a flood, we don't see new valleys form. And so they said, well, geology doesn't work that way now, and we don't think it worked that way in the past either. So the way geology works is uniform. The past and the present, geology probably worked the same way. That's what uniformitarianism is. And so that means changes in the rock record are slow, gradual processes. So this would be fast change, right? This would be slow change. And they said that geological processes are too slow for the Earth to only be 6,000 years old. Folks like Cuvier and Linnaeus thought the Earth was only about 6,000 years old. But they said that's impossible based on how rocks work. That just doesn't fit with the data. Okay? And that led to further ideas about life then, how life might change over time. We know the rock record means that the Earth is a lot older than we thought. And maybe that opens up new windows for explaining the diversity of life. Why is life so diverse? And that's where we'll pick up in the next video.